So we just said that the Romans were copycats. The Romans copied the other people's items and things from their culture. Some of the examples are from the Etruscans. They took a number of things, and the Etruscans, for instance, had togas. These were these sheets that covered the body, kind of draped over the body. That was an Etruscan thing, but we totally have lost that in history. We immediately think of Rome when we see anything that has a toga on it. We also see that the Etruscans had an atrium. An atrium is an area of a house which was like a patio inside the house, so it's an open area. So let's just put down patio, like an outside patio, in the house. That was taken, and all the Roman homes took that over. And so your typical Roman house displayed an atrium. A third thing was the actual house plan, or the home plan that a house had, was essentially the Etruscans. They had developed that. The Etruscans had gladiators. They had these fierce fights, and the Romans liked that when they came in and took over Etruria. They took over the gladiators as well. And a lot of paintings that the Romans did were actually started in Etruria with the Etruscans. So an example is where they put the paint into wet plaster. The plaster dries and it kind of holds the color very strongly. They have a term for that, and that's called a fresco. A fresco. And they were still doing frescoes at the time of Leonardo da Vinci. For instance, the Last Supper, the famous painting that he has in the Sistine Chapel at one end, is a fresco. The painting that Michelangelo did on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, that's a fresco. So these painters had to first wet the plaster, make sure the plaster stayed wet while they painted into it. And then as it dried, it held those pigments, okay? Now, a portico was another feature. This portico, which is a colonnaded porch, that's from Etruria, excuse me. So in 509 BC, the Romans overthrew Etruscan rule. So they conquered Etruria. And Etrusca was a strong state. They just conquered Etruria and added that to the Roman Republic. And so Roman Republic expanded. And they formed a democratic government. One of the things that Rome had, that sounds really good, and it was, but they had a democratic rule. They elected some of their representatives in the Senate and in the Roman body that made the laws. We talked about, or maybe we haven't really talked much about, Romulus and Remus, the two brothers who founded Rome. And there's a legend that they were raised by a she-wolf. So these were the founders of Rome. And they were raised by a she-wolf. And of course, a she-wolf is a female wolf who gave them milk and sustenance. And a lot of the symbols of early Rome show these two little baby boys, suckling and gaining milk from this wolf. Well, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you But the Romans conceived themselves very wild, somewhat barbaric. Here's your two founders being raised by a wolf. I mean, that's crazy when you think about that. Just wild, rugged, tough. This was the view the Romans had of themselves. They come from a tough start. So Romulus and Remus were raised, and Romulus eventually kills Remus. In the legend, we don't know if that's true. It probably has some elements, true elements to it. But Romulus kills Remus, his brother. And of course, Rome is named after Romulus. You kind of see Rome in that. So it's easy to remember who kills who. Romulus survives, and Romulus becomes the first king of Rome. And so while they have some representation from the people, 753 BC is the date that history gives to Romulus being this very first king of the Romans. So let me clean that up a little bit. Yeah. So they come from a tough background, a difficult place. Now, a couple things about Rome that we need to see in their early development, really almost from the start. Consuls ruled Rome. So these consuls ruled Rome beginning about 753, very shortly after Romulus becomes king. There's two of them, and they're appointed by the Senate. So the senators, the first families of Rome, kind of the first major individuals, they're members of the Senate. They appoint these two consuls. The consuls have a one-year term, and they had all the executive power. Now, the executive power, of course, the legislative power is the power to make laws. The executive power means they executed the laws. So we get the word executive. They execute the laws, meaning they carry the laws out. So they would be like today's governor or the president. They execute the laws. They carry out the laws that the legislature passes. And Rome in those days had very strong families. There's no record, for instance, of any divorce for about 300 years in early Rome. So it's pretty strong families, a strong sense of order in the Roman home and in this early republic. The next important group that we want to look at is the Senate. So we've talked about the consuls who were appointed by the Senate. Let's take a look at the Senate. The Senate were members of noble families. So the noble families, the founders of Rome, had their individual there in the Senate. They were the landowners. They tended to be very wealthy. The original founders of Rome. Now, to me, it's very interesting how the Romans arranged this third part of their government, this General Assembly. Because what they did is the General Assembly was really all the male citizens in Rome. They could meet and suggested changes in the laws to the Senate. They were all lower class people, the poor class. And they were able to elect two tribunes. So these two tribunes would protect the people's rights in the Senate. The tribunes would attend the Senate meetings, and when they saw something that the Senate was going to pass, they could stand up and they could veto a law. They would stand up and say, I veto, I forbid this law. And the law would stop right there. The law could not go forward. And so the tribune had a lot of power. He could veto any law, and he was an instrument of the people. And notice that there were two tribunes. They wanted to make sure that the people, if one of the tribunes got corrupt and was corrupted, and they only had a very short time in office, just 1 year, but there were two, that was a safeguard, and it would ensure that the tribune was a better guardian of the people's rights. Now we see this in this play, Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's play, and in the very opening scene, there's two tribunes that are wandering through the streets of Rome, and all these people are so excited they're going to see this guy named Julius Caesar come into Rome. And they're concerned about the people, and they're worried that the people are getting swept along with the allure of supporting Caesar. And that recently they had done the same thing for a general named Pompey, and Caesar had defeated Pompey, and now they were all swept up in this adulation of Caesar. So you see that in this play, that Shakespeare accurately shows that the tribunes were people, officers who were concerned about the people. So the thing I'd like you to remember is that veto means I forbid, and the tribune had that power. Now the people in Rome really were of two classes. The first class was the wealthy class. These were the landowners, the nobles, the founding families of Rome, and these would be the patricians. So here's this cool word, patricians. And of course, pater in Latin means father. So we get patrimony, we get patriot. And so the patricians were these founding families. And later, they would become the senators. So as they provided the senators to the Senate. So the Senate really represented this ruling class of patricians in Rome. Now the second major group or major class of Rome were the plebeians. These were the commoners. Sometimes they were just known as plebs, kind of a little abbreviation there. And they were the working class, the people that were doing most of the labor. They were the laborers, they were the farmers. And for these people who worked all the time, who didn't have lots of money, in fact, for them, as slavery increased in the Roman Empire, and people got lazier and lazier because of all the work the slaves were doing, later, debt becomes a real problem. And among the plebs, the plebeians, debt was this big deal because they started taking loans and couldn't repay the money. And so this became a huge problem in the Roman Empire. One of the things that we also see in Rome is that these consuls, of course there were two of them, they had a 1-year term, one of them always stayed in Rome. So the other led the army. So one consul would be out commanding the army, and it's interesting, they had an army that was civilian-led. That's an interesting concept. That's the same that we do too. We have the president over the army. President is the commander-in-chief, and it's a civilian, not a current military leader who's in command of the military. Same as in Rome. One led the army, but the other one always stayed in Rome. So if there was a killing, a big defeat where the first consul was killed, there would always be a second consul who would be in Rome. Now there's a legend, actually a true story, of a common citizen named Cincinnatus who was important in Roman history because he came out of retirement and served in a war crisis and took over all the power of Rome. He served as a dictator. And so because he had the power centralized and he made good decisions, they won the war. And then he stepped down willingly. He didn't stay as dictator. He let go of his power and his dictatorship and returned to being a farmer. So Cincinnatus, very patriotic, loved his country. He's an example to us of civil service and patriotism. So, in fact, today, Cincinnati, Ohio, I think it's the largest city in Ohio, is named after Cincinnatus. And the United States formed a society of Cincinnatus at the time when Washington was the first president. And the Society of Cincinnatus recognized people who served faithfully, who they stepped up, they served, and then they returned to their normal tasks, their normal job. The very first person who was recognized as a member of the Society of Cincinnatus was George Washington. Of course, George Washington served as president. He came out of retirement as a farmer. He went to become president. And then as he finished his second term as president in 1797, he stepped down. And he could have seized power. He could have been a dictator. He could have just stayed there because he was very popular and he had that power. But he didn't. He stepped down and became a farmer. And you and I both know that he loved being a farmer, and he returned to his farm, Mount Vernon, in Virginia, and he farmed until he died. So Washington was the first member of the Society of Cincinnatus. Let me give you a couple minutes to copy this down. Actually, I won't give you a couple of minutes, but I'll give you some time to look at it about Cincinnatus, who, of course, was a Roman citizen. He served faithfully as a dictator over Rome, and then, of course, he stepped down voluntarily and returned to life as a farmer. And so that's why George Washington was the first to be recognized in the Society of Cincinnatus here in America. So I'd like you to get that down. And we are now going to move to part 4. Part 4, we're going to give some additional material. I'm going to send it in about a day, so it's going to get a little bit later. There will be a few more notes, and then it's going to have a section that's going to contain some information about Caesar's Gallic Wars. And so I'd like you to take those notes as well. But that'll come a little bit later. I want to get these three to you now as soon as possible. Thank you, and God bless you.